Hello, my name is Ray Gilbride. Welcome to WeSpeak.com. Today we're going to be talking about Washington State and the laws they passed that literally handcuff the police in Washington State from doing their jobs, which, by the way, is to serve and protect the people of Washington State. Here to help us understand this and see what's going on a national level, we have two officers with over 40 years experience, seasoned veterans. We have Whatcom County Sheriff Bill Elfo from the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office to explain what's going on in Washington State and how it's affecting us. We also have the former Milwaukee County Sheriff, the author of Cop Under Fire, and the current serving president of Rise Up Wisconsin, America's Sheriff David Clarke. So we're going to get on this right away because we have a lot of stuff to cover. So Sheriff Elfo, can you please tell us what in the world the Washington State Legislature was thinking when they passed this, and what's going on with law enforcement in Washington State today?
The Washington State Legislature has enacted a series of new statutes that are really going to impair and impede law enforcement's ability to prevent crime, investigate crime, and apprehend criminals. And I would describe them as being so far as profound and radical. So much so in some instances no other state parallels the limitations we have put on officers in Washington State.
Sheriff Clarke, with this out-of-control movement going across the country, it definitely puts the rest of the states at risk. Any comments on that?
Well, of course, look, it's beyond radical. It's moronic. These are buffoons that are coming up with this kind of policy. They're really tying the hands of law enforcement. Look, it's difficult to be a cop on the street anyway, even under normal situations, but you get these situations they're up against today and it becomes impossible. Police are always have been the last line of defense against savagery, and that's what we're seeing on the streets today with the rise of crime, violent crime all across America, so this will just make it worse.
Sheriff Elfo, you've talked about the Terry stops, the stop and frisk. Can you explain what that is and what is going on with that now?
Well, Terry stop is a stop that's based on reasonable suspicion, not a hunch, not speculation that the officer believes that criminal activity may be afoot. And it's been in American jurisprudence recognized for over 100 years, and it was formally recognized by the United States Supreme Court in a 1969 case called Terry versus Ohio. And basically an officer believes crime is about to happen, has occurred, or is occurring. He can temporarily detain the person he suspects for a brief period. If he has separate suspicion to believe the person is armed, conduct a pat down for weapons to keep everybody safe. And now in Washington State, because of the limitations on force, we can no longer require anyone to submit to a Terry stop. And from my perspective, that is going to have a very serious impact on law enforcement. We can't detain someone unless we now have probable cause, which is a much higher legal standard to detain someone, which is the same standard that's needed to make an arrest.
Sheriff Clarke, your comments on the Terry stop, and is this a needed tool in law enforcement?
It's kind of what an officer has to do. It's going to impede their ability to investigate crimes and also to keep themselves safe. That was what the pat down was all about, to pat down over the outer clothing for what might be a weapon. I said might be. You don't have to know that it is, but you have to articulate it in the end, that it, describe what it felt like, and that you felt that this could be used against you, used to hurt you. And so the Supreme Court realized how difficult it is to do this job anyway, and they also wanted to do it in a way that officers could keep themselves safe. So, as long as they're going to start to raise, I'm talking about Washington State, raise the ante in terms of what officers are going to be able to do to keep themselves safe, it's going to lead to, because it's an officer safety issue, it's going to lead to officers suffering serious injury and or death because some inane political body comes out and thinks they know how to do this job better than people before them. This stuff's all been researched and it's been thought through. It's been through the legal process, but now you're going to get these clowns come along and think they're smarter than everybody else, and they're just going to make it worse. I don't know why a cop today in Washington State would want to continue to do this job because, like I said earlier, one hand was always tied behind their back as a law enforcement officer, but now both hands are tied behind their back.
Sheriff Elfo, can you comment on the morale of the officers in Washington State and how their reaction to this state-sponsored attack on their ability to protect the people is?
The officers are thoroughly demoralized as a result. They feel like they've been let down by the elected officials that should be supporting them in the legislative branch of government. We've seen from our own agency people taking early retirements. We had an officer, 18 years, a great detective, just said, I can't take this anymore, and he moved to Texas. And where we used to have hundreds of people applying for every single vacant position, a lot of interest in being law enforcement officers, that pool of available applicants has been cut down. Less people want to go into law enforcement, not only because of this law, but because of the vile rhetoric and the false narrative that's painted by many around the state that demonizes police officers.
Sheriff Elfo, Sheriff Clarke's book, Cop Under Fire, on page 28, he actually talks about a situation where they had some officers in a high-speed pursuit situation where they did eventually get the people. And this call particularly talks about the permission to terminate the pursuit. But can you tell us a little bit about the pursuit laws now in Washington State?
Well, this legislature has put serious restrictions on when we can engage in a vehicular pursuit. We used to be able to pursue a vehicle, and all our officers are thoroughly trained in decision making and pursuit driving. They qualify with that annually. So it's not something we take lightly. We recognize pursuits can be dangerous activity, but police work in itself and keeping our community safe is dangerous. But now that same standard I talked about before, the difference between reasonable suspicion and probable cause, we can't pursue anyone unless the officer has probable cause to believe a serious violent felony, which they define in the statute, has been committed. This does not include most domestic violence cases. This does not include most assaults that occur on police officers. So we're allowing criminals to evade justice and to evade apprehension and engage in ultra dangerous activity by fleeing officers and vehicles.
Sheriff Clarke, the laws now in Washington State, had they been across the United States, the chase talked about in your book on page 28 probably would not have happened. Comments on what this is going to do to affect law enforcement?
Look, officers make judgments as they move through a tour of duty based on their experience, based on the area they're working in, if it's a high crime area, and that's kind of what we're talking about here. But these are investigatory stops. You can't know for sure what the heck is going on. Look, traffic enforcement, traffic stops are an effective tactic to use as part of a larger strategy to keep control of the streets, to keep the peace, and to keep crime suppressed. And so, you look at what can happen out of a traffic stop that might seem to be benign. You're going to find people wanted on serious felony warrants. You're going to find illegal drugs and perpetrators in possession of weapons that they're not supposed to have because many of them are convicted felons. So you might be stopping a car that's on their way to a drive-by shooting or coming from a drive-by shooting. And as long as the perpetrator knows if they flee that there isn't much that the officer can do, and this plays itself out. The City of Milwaukee Police Department, not my agency, the Milwaukee County Sheriff's Office. The City of Milwaukee Police enacted a no pursuit policy. What did it do? It led to more people fleeing from the police when they found out that they could flee and nothing would happen. It led to more serious crashes because people were speeding away at a high rate of speed. And so it had the opposite effect. But like I said, instead of basing this on people who have done this and on the research out there involved in terms of what policing is like, you have these numbskulls come along and enact these policies. And it's at the detriment, not just of the officers, but it's at the detriment of the community.
Sheriff Elfo, in Washington State now, as a result of this catastrophic failure of the legislation, if somebody robs a store or robs my home, you guys pull up, you got the description of them and their car, and you see them. Can you go after them now?
Oh, we can't we can't pursue a vehicle. We could still attempt to pull the vehicle over, but who's actually in control is the bad guy driving the car. They're the ones that determine whether they're going to drive away and a pursuit's going to occur. And we could just think of a lot of examples of how this is going to play out. Residential burglary, that is, we cannot, someone breaks into your home, you give a description of the vehicle, we can't pursue. That's not a serious violent felony under how the legislature has defined the law. We get a report of an incident where a child is abducted and maybe they gave a description of a tan colored Honda fleeing the area. Well, just because we see a car that matches the description doesn't mean we can stop the car. Might be reasonable suspicion, but not probable cause. So we would have to let that go. And how many situations are we going to have where abducted people, people in danger, victims of domestic violence, people that have assaulted officers are going to be able to walk away and escape? And as the sheriff said, this is just going to lead, from my perspective, to more people fleeing, driving recklessly, and putting the entire community in danger.
This kind of drastic legislation doesn't happen overnight. It starts small and spreads across the country in little bits. Sheriff Clarke, can you comment on the county that you used to work in now can no longer call prisoners inmates or prisoners? They now, I believe, have to call them people in our care. What do you think about that?
I couldn't believe it. The agency that I used to lead, it's gone soft. It really has. But fortunately for us in Wisconsin, the legislature, controlled by the GOP, has not done any of this stuff. They understand what it's like, must be like anyway, for law enforcement officers. Some of the legislatures are former law enforcement officers, and they can talk sense into these bodies. But, again, this stuff is all in an attempt to appease cop haters. These are people who don't like the police. People have no use for the police. The criminal is in control of many of these cities now. Look at Chicago again this weekend, 66 shot, leaving 6 dead. That goes on every single 72-hour period from Friday to Sunday in the city of Chicago from Memorial Day through Labor Day. So think of all the carnage. Think of all the death and destruction. You have blood flowing through the streets, this violent crime, because the criminals are in charge. They've been emboldened. They know they're in charge. The police have been defanged. The police have been emasculated, and basically, they've thrown up their arms in a quiet resignation. And you really can't blame them, because here's their choice. They can go out and aggressively police and either end up having to shoot some perpetrator to save their own life, or they end up with a criminal charge against them. And I don't like those odds. And if those were my only two choices, I would do what a lot of law enforcement officers in some of these larger cities are doing. And it's, you go to the 911 call, you'll answer the call. But short of that, you're not going to do the discretionary policing. And that's the best kind of policing to keep crime and violence in check.
Sheriff Elfo, can you explain a little bit more about why the 12-gauge shotgun can no longer be used as a platform for an intermediate weapon in law enforcement?
Well, the legislature decided to prohibit the use of what they define as military equipment. And they define that in part as any firearm with a caliber of over 50. So that includes the 12-gauge shotgun. The 12-gauge shotgun in Washington State was our platform for delivering less lethal beanbag rounds, where it allowed us to take advantage of time, distance, and cover, and reduce the chance that we actually have to use deadly force. Well, that tool was taken away in the last legislative session. And so we went out, we equipped our officers with an air gun at the tune of about over $125,000 for a relatively small agency to be able to continue to have a less lethal option available. And we hear from the legislature, well, that's not what we meant to do, but that is what they did.
So let's get this straight. The state legislature passes laws, then tells law enforcement that's not what they meant, expecting law enforcement officer to interpret it during a situation, knowing they can be held civilly and personally responsible. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, that's the whole thing. They put the officers in a very difficult position, wanting them to interpret legislative intent when the plain meaning of the statute says something to the contrary. And they've expanded the consequences for officers. They passed legislation making it easier for people that are engaged in felony crimes to sue law enforcement officers. They put that as a priority in their legislative agenda, and that was enacted into law. They've expanded the ability of the Criminal Justice Training Commission to revoke an officer's certification, and they've increased criminal liability for police. So if we think the officers are going to put their necks out there and to do what they think the legislature intended, I think they have another think coming.
Sheriff Clarke, do you see any of this kind of stuff happening in the areas you're at now?
I haven't done that in Wisconsin. I know there's the state of Minnesota, which is a state that borders Wisconsin, but they have some crazy people in the legislature too. But they put together a series of bills that really limits what a law enforcement officer can use in terms of tools. Look, when I started in policing 40 years ago, a cop had their firearm and a wooden bat, and that was it. Those were the only two tools that they had at their disposal. So you had to go from using a bat and a wooden bat, and if that didn't work, you had to go to a firearm. So years and years of research, and pleased by the public, demands by the public to come up with intermediate weapons. And you know what? We complied. We did. Now all of a sudden, officers have pepper spray, they have tasers, they have. We've developed a force continuum that is a recommendation, but officers can jump around that force continuum. You don't have to go step by step. But now we did that because of the demands of the public, that officers have more options other than deadly force. And so we gave these officers all these tools, and now the same people want to take these tactics and these tools away from officers. Fortunately, in Minnesota, the legislature did pass that bill, the state legislature. A federal judge put a stay on it because even the judge had the common sense, the good sense, I should say, to say, you know what? You're not leaving officers many more options. This is going to lead to more use of deadly force because there are no intermediate weapons. And, they didn't think about that at the time, this crazy state legislature. But everything that they do is going to have the adverse effect of what they want to do, and it's going to lead to, like I said, casualties among the public and also among law enforcement officers.
And we see that also, Sheriff Clarke, where they've eliminated the legislature our use of the vertical lateral neck restraint as a means to subdue someone in a situation where an officer's life is in danger or a civilian's life is in danger. Under no circumstances can we use that any longer, or under no circumstances could we use a chokehold. And we've had an officer murdered in this state that was strangled to death, a female officer working in a prison. If that were to occur today, if she was able to reverse the chokehold, she would not be able to do that under the Washington state law as it stands.
The other thing too is none of this is based on any research or data. The use of chokeholds, so on and so forth. Look, the use of force is never pretty. It's not meant to be pretty. It's not designed to be pretty. It's supposed to be reasonable, and it's supposed to be effective. And an officer has to articulate afterwards why they use that force, and that's the reasonableness part of it. So when you take these things away, everything that these legislators are doing is based on emotion from cop haters, for heaven's sakes. They're taking no community law-abiding people input. They're not taking any of the law enforcement experience in this area, supported by data and research to show, okay, we can make fine-tune adjustments. There's no doubt about that. We should always be looking to do that. But to do these wholesale changes like this is not the way to enact public policy.
Sheriff Elfo, can you explain to us why quantity of drugs no longer equals intent in Washington state? This seems to open the door to drug cartels. Am I off base? Can you explain this to us?
Well, let me clarify. Back in February, our state Supreme Court decided that the drug possession laws in Washington state were unconstitutional because there wasn't a knowing requirement. The word knowing didn't occur before the word possession. And they overturned about 60 years of case law in order to do that. It reversed a prior state Supreme Court decision. So the legislature could have corrected that or remedied it cured it by simply inserting the word knowing in front of possession. But they went further. They decided that they would change everything from a Class C felony or higher to simple misdemeanors that can be punished by only up to 60 days in the county jail. And we can't even arrest anyone unless they've been given a business card and referred to treatment unless 2 occasions prior. So, I'm all for providing treatment where appropriate and diverting people into treatment as an alternative to the criminal justice system, but there's no limitation on the quantity. We could have somebody transporting 5, 10, 15 kilos of methamphetamine, fentanyl, heroin, and unless we can't infer intent to deliver or intent to sell merely by quantity. So this is open things up for drug traffickers to move drugs around and distribute them in our community, and we're seeing overdose and overdose deaths on a very frequent basis already in Washington State.
Sheriff Clarke, your comments on this?
Well, it gives the drug dealer the upper hand. Look, everybody knows that we have an opioid crisis in this country. Heroin, fentanyl, crystal meth, and the public has demanded that something be done because we're seeing a lot of overdose deaths as it relates to this sort of thing. Trying to give the benefit of the doubt to the person who's in possession of this stuff, that are they selling or not, that's not the way to go at this thing, and most of these people know it. As long as you're going to tie the hands of the cops again and give the benefit of the doubt to the drug dealer, get used to continued high levels of suicides, high levels of overdose deaths as it relates to those type of narcotics. That stuff is poison. They're peddling it to somebody else's kids. There is no place in our society for this kind of skullduggery as it relates to these dangerous. We're not talking about marijuana here. We're not talking about sniffing cocaine, and I'm not trying to downplay that. We're talking about drugs that are having a devastating effect. You use fentanyl one time, you are addicted. You are hooked. That's how dangerously addictive that stuff is. The same with heroin. And so for the courts, and by the way, the courts are acting as super legislatures when they do, like the State Supreme Court did in the state of Washington. It's not their role here. It's the legislature's role to make the laws. And so if he thinks it's unconstitutional, okay, he gets to make that ruling, but then the legislature needs to go back, and it sounds like they went back and made it worse, but they should go back and sharpen this stuff up and clean it up and tighten it up. I don't have a problem with that. There's still this concept in this country, I believe, and it's consent of the governed. All right, we derive in law enforcement our authority not on our own, from the consent of the governed, and that would be through our elected representatives. So, they might make some laws that I don't agree with. All I'm here to do is to let them know the ramifications of what they're doing ahead of time to try to save somebody's life, save a citizen's life, save a law enforcement officer's life. And then when that does happen, it has its adverse effect. I go right back to them and said, I told you about this. You got blood on your hands over this situation.
Sheriff Elfo, is this not a direct hindrance on law enforcement being able to turn or roll over a small drug dealer to get information on a bigger, more substantial drug dealer?
Well, that's how criminal investigations work, particularly into narcotics. We start with people with small quantities and try to work our way up into the major drug trafficking networks. And being a northern border county, we have a proliferation of drugs here that are transported through the United States to Canada. They're sold here in parking lots along the I-5 corridor. We're a high-intensity drug trafficking area, so it's going to make it far more difficult to build these cases against the major suppliers, the merchants of death that are killing our children.
Sheriff Clarke, I once heard you talk about the fact that a lot of these legislatures make rules without dealing with committees or without talking to law enforcement to see if it actually have the right effect. Comments on that? Am I correct in that?
Sure, they're not consulting with law enforcement. They don't care what law enforcement thinks here. Like I said, they're trying to appease the cop haters. For heaven's sakes, when Barack Obama put together this 21st century task force to reform policing, he didn't have one street level officer on that panel. He had one sheriff, he had a couple of chiefs, and then the rest were cop haters. He had Black Lives Matter at the table at that conference, for heaven's sakes. But again, no frontline officer to give them a perspective. Hey, here's what's really going on the street, and this is what you need to think about. So that's what I mean. There's an example of how nobody cares what the cop thinks. The one who's out there every day, who has to go out and enact these goofy policies that they know won't work. But like I said, this is the consent of the governed. So, you just got to hope that a law enforcement officer doesn't lose their life or some innocent bystander or citizen because of it. But, you can hope all you want. That's exactly what's going on. If you look at the violence going on, even in Milwaukee, we are 5 behind this time last year with homicides, and last year was a record year. So we're only 5 behind with 5 months to go. We're going to surpass it. A lot of these are young kids in the city of Chicago. Deaths among kids under the age of 16 up 300%, for heaven's sakes. This is the result of this war on cops.
Sheriff Elfo, do you know if the state legislature had adequate resources and communication with law enforcement before making these sweeping changes? And if they did they choose to ignore it?
The legislature had a lot of input from the police chiefs and sheriff's association and from associations representing line level officers. There were excellent position papers about the potential consequences that we're seeing now, how they would unfold, and they were highly accurate. But they chose to ignore that and listen to other influential or groups that are ability to influence them. And let me back that up a little bit. It was in 2017, the legislature enacted a series of police reform laws that were negotiated between these groups and some of the activists, and it was sold as a compromise where we'll cut the sandwich in half and move forward. Well, what happens 2 years later? They come back and want the whole sandwich, and now we see ourselves completely handcuffed and unable to protect the community in the way it expects to be protected. And what I'm finding is our citizens are really amazed. When we talk to them, whether they're liberal or conservative, most people that I talk to about this, when they're introduced to this topic and they're learning what's happening and they're seeing how it's affecting their family and communities, they are just thoroughly outraged.
Sheriff Clarke, do you see any of this going on in your areas as well?
Well, the thing is, you get the government you elect. And so while there is some outrage by the electorate, the citizens, the voters, they're the ones that put these clowns in office. They can unelect these people too, but I'll tell you what, it always seems in some of these states that at election time, the same people get reelected over and over and over again because the voters are forgetful when it comes to election day about why they're in the situation that they are, and they tend to vote in the same manner they did in the last election. That's voting behavior. That's how that thing works. So if people are outraged, the way to show it is at the ballot box by getting rid of these people that aren't listening to the will of the electorate.
Part of the defund police movement attacks jail systems as well. Sheriff Clarke, can you comment on what you see in this area?
That's part of the plan, though. The decarceration, the elimination of jails and prisons as a crime control tool, or crime control tools, I should say. Jails and prisons, confinement are very effective crime control tools because you're talking about career criminals, the same people over and over and over again, that revolving door system in many prosecutors' office, in many courthouses, where a law enforcement officer gets some dangerous individual off the street only to be let out the back door even before the ink dries on police reports. So that is, like I said, that's the goal, to get rid of the use of jails and prisons. And so it's working. Everything that's happening today is as the cop haters, as the anarchists designed it to be.
Sheriff Elfo, I know this point is dear to you because when you took over the Whatcom County Sheriff position, they didn't even have a jail. They didn't have a SWAT team. They didn't have an honor guard. You have literally worked hard to build and create a premier sheriff's department, respected by everybody in the state and other states. So when we talk about this incarceration issue and defunding that with jails, what are your comments?
Well, there's this mantra we hear in the community of mass incarceration in America, and they try to portray it as the jails being full of marijuana smokers, and that's just utter nonsense. And they try to remedy that on the back of our local jails by when these jails are falling apart, they're really not fit for human habitation for the inmates that are in there or the folks that work in there to keep the community safe. And they won't allow an expansion, or they won't allow major corrections to be made to the facility. And as a result, we're on what is known as booking restrictions for years, and they've evolved to the point, and particularly in light of COVID and the need for social distancing within the jail and the lack of facilities to keep people that have infectious diseases, really limits our ability. And at points now, we're not serving felony warrants for property crimes. We're not serving most misdemeanor warrants, and we're seeing the courts release people that they normally wouldn't. And we see these people arrested 2, 3, 4 days in a row for similar crimes. So I would call the situation with the jail is that we are in a crisis here in our community, and there's many jails across Washington, I'm sure across the country, are seeing similar results.
Sheriff Elfo, can you tell us a little bit about your over 40 years experience in law enforcement?
Well, I've been in law enforcement for 47 years. I've been in both municipal policing. I've been a police chief. I've been a prosecuting attorney, and been doing this since I'm 19 years old, and I love it. But I'm really, I'm more concerned now than I ever have been in those past 47 years.
Sheriff Clarke, as a respected member of law enforcement, can you tell us about your history in law enforcement as well?
Not as I envisioned, I'll tell you that much. Look, this is a calling. It's a duty. It's a responsibility. But there's no higher honor as far as I'm concerned. I take that back. There's only one higher honor, and that's to wear the uniform of your country, representing your country in the military. But the next highest honor is to wear the uniform of your community. And my community allowed me to do that for nearly 40 years, all throughout the ranks. I started with the Milwaukee Police Department, reached a command level, and then I became the sheriff of the largest county population-wise in the state of Wisconsin, which means I had to get people to vote for me. And a lot of people. We're a county of 1 million people. Milwaukee County is. It's an urban county with all of the problems that urban areas have. But I'll tell you what, it's been an extreme honor for me to have worn the uniform of my community. I was born and raised here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The profession, has changed quite a bit. I've been retired maybe 4 years, 5 years. It has changed considerably. Even 4 or 5 years ago, this job was still doable, but today, I don't know how they do it.
Sheriff Clarke, we appreciate the years of experience in the field you have. People have to learn how to get up and fight. They can no longer just push this off to other people. Can you please tell us how they can help with Rise Up Wisconsin? What is this and what it's all about?
Sure. I'm the president of Rise Up Wisconsin. It's a 501c4. It's a nonprofit. It is a political organizing at grass levels movement. We at grassroots level, the individual, the voter, we have to be better organized if we're going to influence state government. And that's what we're trying to do with Rise Up Wisconsin. People can go to riseupwisconsin.com, poke around, take a look. Look, community organizing is hard work, and it's very expensive. There's a donate button on there. Don't be afraid of it. If you press it, nothing bad will happen to you. But you got to have funds for this in order to get it done. So please, riseupwisconsin.com. This is the role I'm playing right now.
Sheriff Elfo, if people have questions for you, what's going on in the state or what they can do, how can they get a hold of you or your department?
Well, we have a website, and I have my email address on there. I'd be happy to, with any follow-up questions the community might have.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for being on the show today, taking your time out to explain to the people the importance of this. We look forward to having you again. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. Thank you, Sheriff Clarke, for being here, and thank you for the opportunity to help educate the public as to what we're facing here in Washington State in terms of law enforcement.
People, America does have a lot of problems right now. And one of the major ones is we cannot solve them by allowing bigger problems to step in, such as this. We cannot defund the police. We cannot give in to, as Sheriff Clarke would say, skullduggery and thugs. We need to stand up and realize our responsibility is to learn what's going on and to vote people in who will represent us. We need to bring America back to what is right and what's wrong is wrong. No more worrying more about the convicts' feelings than the people they raped or murdered. We need to turn this around now. This is important. It takes you to do your job, to do your civic responsibility, to research and vote for people who will make the right decisions. From Ray Gilbride at WeSpeak.com, thank you for joining us. Have a great day, and remember, be kind to the ones around you.